Hello everyone and welcome to the Dreary Erie. Welcome back to Liam's DMing advice. Because, well, I'm trying to come up with a better name for it, so we might as well go with that. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my personal favorite subjects, which is mythology. But of course I'm going to put it into a D&D framework. Specifically, how are you going to incorporate mythology into your D&D game? A lot of people are probably thinking, well, you don't need to at all. And you are right. You don't need to use any specific mythological characters, but given that this is Dungeons & Dragons, it's a game of fantasy, and our earliest works of fantasy are, in fact, mythology, you're probably going to run into some overlap after a while. So really the question is either how do I avoid evoking mythology, or how do I use mythological tropes and figures to my advantage? 5th edition D&D, as I've seen it, gives a very small amount of consideration to the idea of myths, in the idea of a mythic campaign. Now, the DM's guide is very vague as to what that's supposed to be. It says that generally it's in the style of a great myth, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Toynbee Cúalnge of Irish mythology, but it doesn't really give any specifics. Are you going to use those mythical characters, or are you going to have characters that are as great as them in terms of deeds? I believe the answer can be either or, but given that this is D&D, we're most likely going to be trying to make our own characters, but fit them into a mythic mold. So, what are we talking about when we say, like, a mythical mold? Well, that all depends on what mythology you're looking at, of course, because it will vary from place to place. We have our typical Hellenic, Greek, and Roman heroes that everyone knows. You got, like, Hercules, Perseus, Theseus, all of these guys. Now, they weren't necessarily really good guys, and you'll find this is a common trend with a lot of mythology, is a lot of these guys did things that are really morally questionable. But you've got these great Hellenic myths, where generally the gods are in the favor of someone. And that's very common in other mythologies as well. You have Egyptian mythology, which essentially deals with just the gods. There isn't much room for the human heroes in that one. Then you have, of course, the lesser known, but I would argue equally exciting, if not better, Celtic mythologies. You have, obviously, Welsh and Irish in there. The 5th edition book specifically mentions Cuchulainn, the great Irish hero, as one of the characters that you could look to inspiration for a mythic campaign. Now, as to whether you're actually going to have the party fight off a gigantic cattle raid, well, that's up to your discretion. So, what we're going to do is kind of scan through these different myths and look at how they would work in a D&D setting. Now, obviously, what you want to do is probably find a myth that's a bit more obscure. For some role-playing groups, it's easier than others. I know a lot of role-playing groups have people that are heavy into fantasy, so you might not want to put them into a story that they do know. Or, you might want to, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But first off, let's think of any stories that they might not know about. Maybe you have some of the Mabinogi on hand. You have like one of the you have like the Mabinogion, and you'll just read through that and get yourself a story. Maybe you'll go with like something based off of the Feast of Brickaroo or something like that in Irish mythology, which is relatively obscure. Or, you know, if you're going to go with because again, like, okay, I'll give my personal experience. In my role-playing group, it should probably be really easy to pull the mythology over someone's eyes, really. I mean, we got people that know basically the Greek mythology, maybe a bit of Egyptian mythology, and about as much Celtic mythology as I've told them. So for a group like that, it'd be really easy to just plagiarize something, you know, take the myth kind of wholesale, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because you'll be introducing them to it, but eventually you kind of gotta fess up. But that's a good thing. Having them live out a myth, like you can literally just tell them, okay, I'm putting you in this myth that you've never heard of, and we're going to play through the story. That gives you an advantage because you're going to be retelling the story. You can throw in some twists if you want to, of course. But let's talk about, obviously, what if you're going with a bigger myth? Say you've got, like, the labors of Hercules, or you have the Toyne of Irish mythology. Or even, let's say you go so far as to do an Arthurian tale, which would be quite the feat, but I would appreciate that. In that case, what you're probably looking to do is make it different, or make it seem the same at first. Of course. So let's say you're putting people in the Kingdom of Britannia as it was under Arthur. Well, most people know the basic story of Arthur, even more so now that there was that one TV show that got really popular about Kid Merlin. But in any case, basically you're going to be dealing with people who know the basic premise. Arthur is the king. He has the Knights of the Round Table, all of whom are supposedly his equal, except that they aren't. And then they go and they fight Mordred, and Arthur dies and Mordred dies. And of course you would assume that the heroes in that case would be taking the roles of the Knights of the Round, and they would be helping Arthur. But again, people are going to know that. They're going to know exactly, like, the outline. A lot of them don't know the finer details. Like, I'm not sure how many people know about the love affair between Guinevere and Lancelot, or how many know about the other Knights of the Round Table, such as Sir Kay or Sir Owain. And Gawain, actually, is the more famous one. But in any case, Owain had the cooler name. I think it might actually be Owen. Oh, now I'm going to get into how to pronounce Welsh. That's not good. So in any case, I keep using that term, but you're going to have people who know the basis of the story. They might assume that the end goal of the campaign even is to stop Mordred from killing Arthur or something like that. But you don't necessarily need to do that. Of course, you don't even need to have Arthur or the Knights of the Round Table. You can just take elements from it, which of course is what I would always suggest. I don't generally like to take things from the... I don't like to rip things out of a major work in its entirety. But if you're going to, because I think it's an interesting thing, it's probably really cool for people to actually live through that experience. Again, you could totally, like, switch things around on them. Have Arthur maybe not be the one who even pulled the sword from the stone. You could have your Arthur be like a fake or something like that. Maybe Mordred is the real successor. Maybe he's the real king. Something like that. It's not too hard to imagine how you can change up mythology in your favor. Maybe, let's say, with the cattle raid of Cooley, if you're doing that story from Irish mythology, maybe the Queen of Connacht in this case is actually... Maybe she actually has a point. Maybe King Conchobar is incredibly corrupt, as he actually kind of was in the original stories, but maybe Conchobar is just, like, straight up evil, and you need to defeat him. Maybe your party has to go or has to go mano a mano with Cuchulainn, and I would not suggest that because Cuchulainn would probably annihilate them, but let's say that that's something you could do if you're going to put people actually in the mythology, which again is cool. There are entire RPGs based on that premise. One of the ones that I would, of course, I would give to you in that regard is Celtia, which is a Cubicle 7 RPG based on the Yggdrasil system that is essentially set in the Kingdom of Arthur, and you play as Knights of Arthur, or the followers of Arthur, at the very least. And it's mostly about your conflicts with the Irish, the Anglo-Saxons, and, you know, maybe even some Northmen if things get out of hand, I guess. But then, of course, I'm going to move on to my real topic, I suppose, which is how to incorporate mythological elements properly. We're not talking about taking the actual myth and putting people inside of it. Instead, I'm referring to taking elements of the myth and, like, subtly putting them in there. So, let's say, for example, the classic one is, again, going back to Arthurian legend. You're going to have one of the heroes, one of the party members, perhaps, will be tasked with pulling some magical sword out of the stone to see if he's truly worthy. Or maybe he does so by accident, and people start hailing them as a hero. Something like that. Along those lines could be pretty interesting. Alternatively, you could very easily make a reference to the cattle raid of Cooley by simply having the players repel a cattle raid or something like that, which is, again, relatively easy. Then you've got, like, all the magical items you can bring in from mythology. And that's one of the things where You've always heard of the saying, there's nothing new under the sun. Well, that's basically true here as well. Mythology's basically got you covered for most cool ideas you could come up with. In Irish mythology alone, I can name a spear that instantly kills anyone it hits, a sword that controls the wind and cuts through any shields, and additionally a sword that shoots laser beams. So that's in Irish mythology alone. You've already got those ideas. You've got a hero who can transform into a freaking flaming beast monster. You have a hero who can cure people of wounds by running water through his hands. You have a salmon that contains all the world's knowledge. These are things that you find even just in Irish mythology. Or, you can also go with some of the other ones. You can go with, like, Persian mythology, or really just Persian literature, and have, like, the Submerge and things like that. That's the whole reason you go to mythology, really, is you want to get those cool ideas that, they've already been done before, but it's up to you to decide how you're going to utilize them. So how I would incorporate mythological elements. Of course, you use them sparingly, but again, this is fantasy, so we can't really help it too much if it comes in. And it's got to have some kind of impact, I would say. It's one thing to have the party come across, like, Excalibur or something like that across their journeys. But it's another thing to, just kind of blow past Robin Hood as they're on their way to a mission and just kind of, like, flip him off. I'd say that generally if you're going with mythological stuff, if you have respect for the mythology, it's got to mean something. Like, things like momentous stuff. Like, whenever you kill a dragon in D&D, that's big news. But what if that dragon had a name? What if it's something like Fafnir? What if drinking its blood gives you the ability to speak to birds? Of course, if you're a druid, you can already do that. But what if you're a fighter and now you can speak to birds? That's a pretty cool power, right? There's tons of great ideas that have been found in mythology, some of which would be too overpowered for your normal D&D campaign, but I assume if you're doing like a mythic campaign and you want your characters to be real heroes, hell, perhaps even demigods, then you're probably going to be running into some overpowered stuff along the way. I mean, you've got Excalibur, which is basically a blade that makes its wielder immortal, and things such as that. I don't know if you want to go that far, but these are just the ideas that we kind of owe to the legends and mythology of the past. In any case, as I said, use it sparingly, I suppose, and it should be good. Or you can just go, I guess you could say, it's not really overboard, but you could go, like, deep into it, and you could have it all based off of mythology. Either of those approaches is entirely good, as long as, you tell your party about... I think the one way, if you're doing heavily mythological, you should tell your party. If you're adding some elements from mythology, then go ahead and don't tell them about it, because obviously the surprise is going to be far better. Then I kind of thought about the issue of morality, right? I mean, you might think, well, these legendary heroes, they're supposed to be really heavily moralistic. And this is where I get into mythology's darker parts. Not really. Sure, you've got virtuous heroes like Odysseus. Now, he's a relatively virtuous hero. But then you have people like Theseus, who's like essentially a womanizer, and he can't even remember simple things that would save people's lives, like, change the frickin' sails on your ship or something like that. But you also got bastards like Hercules, who's like, by the way, I'm just gonna murder all you guys because you pissed me off once. And sure, he does his labors to atone for it, but he's a murderer. We're not supposed to respect him for it, right? And then, of course, you've got Cuchulainn, who, when he's not saving Ulster from imminent peril, goes around murdering and raping people for very little provocation, essentially forcing himself on tons of women, and eventually killing the King of Munster just for taking the prizes that were essentially awarded to him. Now, true, he did kidnap a woman, but really, were the people of Ulster going to do anything better? I don't think so. So, really, you gotta learn that heroes are douchebags. So, you know, a lot of people would think heroes are lawful good, or at worst, they're chaotic good. That's not necessarily the case. I think your heroes can be douchebags. Can they be evil? No. No, they can't. That's not really something that heroes do. So I think if you're doing a mythology kind of campaign, your heroes are obviously going to be the good guys. Can't believe I would have to say that. See, what's another good thing for a mythological campaign? Probably the use of gods a lot. In D&D, I tend to not like to include the gods, though early on when we were playing D&D, people liked to invoke the gods whenever they got really shit rolls to hope the god, hoping that the gods would help them. And, you know, sometimes they did. But nowadays, I really distance myself from having the intervention of deities. Of course, with a mythological campaign, that all goes out the window. Your player characters are most likely demigods, and if they aren't demigods, then they're probably favored by the gods in some way or another. They're probably embroiled in the battles of the gods, whether they know it or not. They're probably some sort of divine tool being used by a god. Maybe they're accidentally working for the wrong god. You know, again, these are just some different suggestions, but I think with the mythological campaign, not only your character is going to be stronger, but they're going to be coming into contact with gods a lot more. So how much is too much when it comes to the power level of these campaigns? I think that's really up to whoever you are as a DM, but you have to remember, if the characters are overpowered, then the enemies are overpowered as well, because that's what mythology is about. It's not about winning easy battles. It's about heroes that are so much stronger than your average man, which is why they can take on these terrible creatures. It's why Bellerophon was able to slay the Chimera. It's why Orpheus is able to play his way past the guard dog of hell. It's because these people are gifted with these strengths that they're able to face even greater challenges. So, of course, don't go easy on them. Don't make this like a murder fest. If they're, like, super powerful, if they're, like, demigods or something like that, then they're gonna be fighting a Tarrasque at some point. That's just how it works out. And, you know, I would not advise even against stopping these characters from dying, giving them, like, magical regeneration or something like that. I know if it's 5th edition, they can't die anyways, but I wouldn't even say against that stuff, because in mythology even, if you look back at it, if you look back at the Odyssey, if you look at the Toynbee Kulna, these great works of mythology, people die, and they die a lot. Like, a lot of the allies of Cuchulainn, they die. Cuchulainn himself dies in battle. King Arthur dies in battle. A lot of these heroes make heroic sacrifices in the end. Now, as to whether you want to extend the life of a player character, completely up to you. But even in a mythological kind of overpowered setting, where these people are like demigods, they have some godly powers themselves, that really shouldn't stop you from, you know, kind of slitting the throats. I just made the slitting the throat motion.